Hello and welcome to Superhero Ethics. On this week's episode, we're discussing the idea of clones and being uploaded and different consciousnesses. We're going deep into science fiction using altered carbon and a number of different stories as reference points to discuss who is the self and what are we accountable to when numerous versions of ourselves are running around doing things. All that and more after a commercial break that I have no control over, but maybe my clone does. Welcome back. I'm Matthew. I'm your host. Joining me, as is becoming pretty common when we dive into some of the more deep and philosophical questions from science fiction, is Rob McKenzie. Rob, how are we doing today?
Doing pretty well. Had an average work day, and I'm excited about talking about people's brains being copied, basically.
Yeah. You know, Rob, you are now at that status point for me with guests where there's a couple specific topics that sometimes I'll think of and I want to have you on. I definitely want to get you back at some point for Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
I'm at some point going to get you back on the Star Wars bandwagon when we start talking about some of the Legends canon novels and things like that. But I know also every now and then I can just poke you and go, hey, I want to have you on. What do you want to talk about? And you're always going to bring up something that is a little more esoteric than what I normally talk about. And every time you bring up the topic, and at first I am like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I think he's just too smart for me. And then we get into it, and I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work. But then it turns out to be a great podcast. So, as always, you brought up a topic, and I was like, okay, cool. By now, you've earned my trust. I think we can run with this.
Yeah. And honestly, this is just a continuation of a previous episode in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
We had an episode that we recorded that was all about the future of like uploading people at all, right?
Right.
Like what are the ethics of the future of people's brains in non-human bodies in a lot of ways, mm-hmm. right? And that episode leads smoothly into assuming uploads happen. There's a lot of weird legal and social and ethical and societal questions all related to
right.
My brain is no longer connected to this hunk of meat that is my body, right?
No, I think that's a great way to phrase it. And I should be clear as we start out that for what we're talking about today, you know, often we are... First of all, this episode is very much about the science fiction side of the superhero genre that we discuss. And often I will do an episode where it's based specifically on a particular piece of media. Just last week, we put up an episode about X-Men Dark Phoenix. We had a lot of fun with it. We kind of wandered around a couple of different ethical questions, all related to that movie. Today, we're doing something on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I want to be clear, if you have no idea the different movies or TV shows that we're referencing, that's fine. Because today, I think what we really want to do is dive into these specific questions that science fiction and these kind of stories often brings up. And we're going to reference the different stories that do, but much more we want to get into the questions themselves. And so with that, let me kind of just use that to talk about what is the question we're getting into. We're talking about this idea of being uploaded. And this is a concept you see in science fiction a lot. I think Altered Carbon on Netflix, which Matthew Caroline did a great series on that you can find on the Pandavision podcast, is a great example of it, but it's a theme that we see in science fiction all the time. And Rob, fill this in as you would. I think the base of it is the idea, like you said, of what happens when we can separate the human brain, and then that may also get questions into, or the human mind or the human soul, the human consciousness from the human body.
Right.
And when the essence of a person can leave their body and either just enter into a computer writ large or enter into another, flesh sack. Is that about kind of the essence of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's about it. And it's treated in different ways by a lot of different authors and a mm-hmm. lot of different media producers. So you have basically there is only one of a person you can copy, but you can copy somebody over and it deletes the old one, right. In some way. Or there's some ironclad law against running multiple copies. Altered Carbon has this in the books, and it's mentioned in passing in the show mm-hmm. that you can't run multiple copies of yourself, and right. Demi the twin is running 2 copies of himself, which is super illegal, and carries the penalty of deletion, right? And it isn't really dug into much, but that's his way of getting around it. Is he's made people immortal and copyable, and then makes it illegal to do the second half of that, right? And then there's for instance, the Old Man's War books by John Scalzi. Mm-hmm. They copy consciousness from one body to another. And when they do that, there's a brief instant where the bodies lock eyes, and then the old body just gives up the ghost and decides to die. And it's a very convenient plot point that there are multiple copies of anybody running around.
Yeah, I can understand this. Well, and it's funny because earlier we had you on to talk about the idea of time travel.
Right.
And how, time travel, one of the things it does is to create all sorts of ethical paradox. Not even ethical, but just like create paradoxes of causality and things like that. And we talked about how, like, the time travel we like tends to be the one where they do put rules in to some extent that at least explain how that happens.
Right.
Here, I think we're getting into, it doesn't necessarily have to be a paradox per se, but it gets into similar questions because everything we understand about the consciousness is that it is one single entity. So part of that idea of, like, if you copy yourself, like, well, what can the self be copied? Can it be reproduced? All these are just fascinating questions to explore.
Right. And the way that we're probably going to have it happen, as we talked about in the previous one, is having an expert system learn to respond exactly the same as you. That's the easy way. So if I have a computer that spends all of its time with me, right, and it learns to respond exactly as me, and it's the same as me in all but a very diminishingly small number of cases, like it responds the same to every input, is that me? If it thinks it's conscious, is it conscious? If it claims to be conscious, is it conscious? But we talked about that previously, so we don't have to get into that much. We can just assume, for the sake of saying so, yes. So you can copy somebody's mind either that way or using more destructive methods, and you can get 2 copies of the person's mind, right? And that could be, or you can get 2 copies of the physical person, cloning, right? That cloning isn't that much different. Right. Like perfect duplicate clones that retain all the memories. There's a classic Star Trek episode, Star Trek: The Next Generation, where William Riker gets cloned via transporter accident, right? Mm-hmm. And Thomas Riker, they're pretty. They don't even go into a lot of the depths of it. Thomas Riker is a Starfleet officer at a lower rank. He didn't get all the promotions William Riker did.
Right.
And it raises some questions. Is he a member of Starfleet? Should he get back pay? Should he get some of Will Riker's pay? Assuming that they got paid because they're this hand-wavy post-scarcity society, right?
Yeah, I think the Will Riker stuff is fascinating, as well as the example of clones that I think of all the time, which is the clones in Star Wars.
Yep.
Now, I know that you are a hardcore Legend guy who lost interest once they got rid of all that. But have you seen the TV show The Clone Wars?
I have not. I probably should.
I think you would like it for a number of reasons. But one thing it does is it really goes deep onto these questions because of the idea of all of these clones, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them, millions of them, but who then wind up developing individual and unique personalities. Mm-hmm. And to kind of frame this, I'm actually going to throw back some philosophy as well. Do you know what I mean when I talk about process thought?
Maybe. Could you clarify that a little?
So process thought, or philosophy and theology, or the philosophy certainly, is the creation of this guy named Alfred North Whitehead. And I will say he is a phenomenal thinker and a horrible, terrible writer. So as much as you can, read the people who talk about him, not him himself. But the central idea of his the central idea of his thought, it's kind of like a quantum philosophy. Because it's the idea of that, for example, there's no such thing as rob the noun.
Yes. That
Rob McKenzie is a verb. In that, at every moment, there is an entity that is robbing. Not stealing, but doing the process of being robbed. Right. And that at every moment, that process is happening by you interacting with the things around you and interacting with the things that aren't around you and becoming a new, that at every single moment there is a, Rob Mark 1.8,642, Rob .163, etc. And so it's the idea that everything exists as these processes in motion instead of like a fixed point.
Right.
For me, that's actually how I approach a lot of this, and why the Star Trek and Star Wars examples came up for me, because I tend to think of it as, if you're going to clone like that, what you can do is say, I can copy every single experience and every single moment and every single reaction that this person has had up to this moment.
Yep.
But that once a single moment has passed and you have two clones who are now experiencing different things, you now have two different entities, and that they're now starting to have different experiences and thus becoming different process in motion going forward. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. That forking, in computer terms, that's forking a process, right? So if you split it off and it does something different.
Right.
From the initial process. And the initial process keeps doing whatever it's doing, and the fork goes off and does something else.
Right.
I actually just double-checked. I didn't know him the way that you... From process philosophy, I know him from mathematics, because he's part of the Whitehead and Russell duo that tried to make a foundation for how math even exists. But
oh yeah, that makes sense. It's a fascinating thing, because he is, his philosophy is very, very mathematically and kind of quantum based, and yet it's beloved by very progressive theologians, because there's all sorts of theological ramifications if the idea is that God is a process and not a person or an entity. But then you get a whole bunch of theologians who all went into theology because they were really bad at math and science, trying to understand him, and all sorts of problems exist.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's use that as kind of the jumping off point. So in terms of just starting with this idea of clones, before we move into like other kind of uploads, like how would you see it? Like, is it a single self that is now divided? Is it a self that is now forking, as you talked about? Where would you see those kind of things happening?
So my take on it is, a person is the sum of their memories as a process, right? Mm-hmm. So if I go back and pick up a version of myself from a year ago, say that I could make backups of myself,
right?
And over the last year, I did a bunch of crime, right? Mm-hmm. And then I get in a shootout with the police and get killed, and then I get restored from a backup from a year ago. And the backup of me from a year ago has never done any of those crimes. I don't believe that me is responsible.
Right.
Because that me is not the result of the memories that don't exist in its life. But yeah.
Well, and that itself raises a great question, because the you of a year ago is the person who hasn't committed the crimes.
Yep.
But is the person, at least by the way they're thinking of it, who would choose to do those crimes if everything else went the same? Does that now?
Right.
I think there's an argument someone could make there for like there's a Minority Report idea there, which I think is deeply ethically problematic. But could we learn something about you knowing that version of you would commit crimes, all other things being equal?
I mean, we could, but I mean, from that perspective, we know that most people will, if put in the right circumstances, do bad things, right?
Right.
They'll do crimes, or like they'll steal a loaf of bread to feed their family at the very minimum, right? And so, like, people, like, a lot of fiction deals with people being put in circumstances that they don't want to be in to do things they don't want to do, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing with iterative versions of people in fiction is that you get to see their responses again to the new stimulus. There's a great bit in Neuromancer, which is a classic science fiction novel by William Gibson, and they have one of the objects the guy has is a highly illegal read-only memory construct of a famous hacker. Mm-hmm. And he plugs it in, and he asks Dixie Flatline, this construct, some questions. Dixie responds in a certain way. He unplugs it so that it doesn't have any memory, plugs it back in so he's booted up from scratch, asks the same questions, and gets the same answers. There's no variation. He's got the same memories, and you fed him the same input, like you were saying. And people are complicated enough that I don't think, like, if you asked me the same question on the same day, I don't think I'm that deterministic. I'm somewhat deterministic, but there's going to be some amount of randomness in my response. right?
Right. I think that's really important because if we follow that line of thought too far of, you are the sum of all of your, experiences and moments. And so any human entity that had that exact same copied, every, butterfly flapping its wings 1,000 miles away experience would always do the exact same thing. Then you should, we're now returning to questions of agency. What is the self? And it's funny to me, this is very science fiction based because, I can hear a whole bunch of theologians screaming in the corner, what about the soul? What about any kind of idea of there being something? And is there an essence to you beyond just who you are is shaped by your experiences and the scientific nature of it all?
Right. And can you change that underlying self?
Right.
Memory editing is a result of uploading and uploading, right? Have you ever seen the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind?
It's one of those movies that I haven't seen, but I've heard referenced so often that I probably know a good deal about it.
Okay. It deals with memory editing. Is one of its key themes, and the protagonist and other protagonists edit their memories of each other away, but they still end up falling in love again. And
right.
To boil down a lot of what's going on in the movie, right, is they keep meeting each other and they keep finding each other, right, after they edit the memories away. And the question is, if I edit the memories away, so let's say that instead of I do all these crimes for a year, and instead of restoring from a backup, I just delete all the memories of all the crimes. I keep all the boring days. I keep the Tuesdays where all I did was eat jelly sandwiches and play Minecraft or whatever, right?
Right.
And so
I would commit crime if I had to do that every Tuesday. But yes, go ahead.
Right, but exaggeration. But I keep all the boring days and I delete all the crimes. Am I still responsible for them? Is the follow-up question. Because I'm an upload that's able to see the scope of my consciousness laid out, and I can selectively delete memories. And so the question is, am I responsible for those things now that I've deleted the memories?
It's fascinating because we're less than 20 minutes in, and we've already tied back into what I think is often the central superhero ethics question, which is, crime and justice. Because I think to some extent what we're getting at is, at their very base level, the two fundamentally different philosophies of our criminal justice system. Right. One of which is, you did this thing, and therefore you should be punished. And now the question of you, as you bring it up, is, if you're not cognizant of the fact that you did it, or if it wasn't actually you who did it, then should you or shouldn't you be punished? But all those questions go away if you look at it from a completely different lens, which is, are you a person who is likely to have you committed a crime, thus telling us that you are likely to possibly commit a crime again? Thus, should we not punish you, but try to take steps to, A, remove you from the ability to commit crimes and do harm, and B, change you so that you're no longer wanting or able to do those crimes. Right. And it's funny because the second thing I talk about is often considered the most progressive. I think I came up with the most fascist and tyrannical way to talk about it in the way I described it. But it's the idea of you robbed a house, so we're going to punish you, versus, you robbed a house, we don't want you to rob houses, so we're going to put you in a position where you can't rob houses, but also hopefully put you in a situation where you no longer feel like you need to rob houses to survive or do whatever the heck you need to do. Right. And it seems like here that's what we're getting at here, because if your goal is punishment, then you're right. Whether or not someone remembers those things is very relevant. Yes. But, if you commit those crimes, if every time I get drunk, I'm in a total blackout and I hurt somebody, it doesn't matter if I remember them or not. It doesn't remember if I'm to blame for them or not. I think I am, given my understanding of alcohol and blame. But right. If you can put it, so if something totally different, if I'm causing harm to people, the harm needs to be stopped whether I remember it or not. Right.
And so one of the things that kicked me off on this is a great trilogy that starts with The Quantum Thief, by Hanu. I'm going to murder this last name, Rajanimi. And he's a Finnish author, and he wrote a trilogy of science fiction books that are, the protagonist is an upload of a thief. who deleted all of his memories of his grand escapades and crimes.
Right.
And a big chunk of the plot is him trying to recover these memories because he's been pressed into service by one of the lords of the solar system to try to accomplish another grand task for them. And he needs to know how he accomplished all the things he did in the past. He doesn't even remember planning. But as many great novels do, it starts in a prison. He's in prison for crimes he doesn't remember committing. Right. And the prison, though, is a rehabilitative one. It's called a dilemma prison. You're familiar with the prisoner's dilemma?
Mm-hmm.
And so what it is that it's a bunch of cells with copies of him. And he gets matched against a copy in an adjacent cell. And they have to do iterated prisoner's dilemma with pistols pointed at each other. And when you succeed at the prisoner's dilemma, you get copied to an adjacent cell. If you fail, one of that copy of you gets deleted.
Oh God!
This is the opening caveat, and it's full of prisoners that are having this done. The goal is to rehabilitate them. It's to teach them to cooperate. Cooperating is better. So if you cooperate more you survive more.
So this is definitely on that fascist, tyrannical side of rehabilitative prisons that I was discussing earlier.
This is a spooky, scary, tyrant-ruled solar system that's not a place anyone wants to live, right?
Right.
But it's technically rehabilitative. They're like, well, we're pretty sure because you did this, even though you deleted your memories, that we want to make you better. So we're going to teach you how to be better by using the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Right. It's insane, but it's a caveat in a post-human science fiction novel. But he doesn't remember doing the crimes that he's doing his time for.
Right. Well, and I think that's also a very important part when the goal is to some extent not rehabilitation. When the goal is not restitution. Like to some extent of like you do have to understand and know the crimes that you did in order to confess them, in order to seek recompense for them, or not recompense, but to give recompense to others. Yeah. Here, my former co-host, our good friend Jacob Malichich, would probably be yelling at me. Have you seen Babylon 5, or has he failed you?
So I kept trying to watch Babylon 5 back when all of the digital copies sucked, and I missed it when it was on television. And then I got angry at it all the time for switching aspect ratios. Supposedly
that's legit.
Supposedly they fixed that, so it's on my list along with Avatar to go through.
Do you mind if I spoil a plot point of?
I've read tons of stuff on it. I just haven't actually watched the whole thing.
Do you mind if I spoil a plot point of a one-off episode?
Go right. Like I said, I've read a ton about it. You probably aren't actually spoiling.
So there is an episode in it which raises these very same questions, where there's someone who was a complete unrepentant serial killer, just the worst of humanity, with 1990s understanding of mental illness and crime. Mm-hmm. There's problems there, but fair enough. And the idea is, in this system, there is no death penalty. Instead, there is what they call the death of personality, in which they basically 100% lobotomize, complete mind wipe you, and install, because they have telepaths and things like that, a new personality. And this new personality is friendly and docile and gentle and is willing to be a happy member of society. And the crux of the episode is that the family of the victims of the killer figure out what's happening and basically want to do justice, want to have vengeance against the person who killed their family members, even though that person, they're basically just wanting to attack the meat sack that killed their people, because it's now a totally different person inside there. And I think you would really like it because it raises a lot of these same questions of who is responsible. Because, it doesn't quite go this level, but to some extent I think what we're talking about here is, in that situation at least, this is now a new person. It's the meat sack, it's the physical hands that held the knife that killed your loved one, but the person, the essence of that, the personality, is dead and gone. Right.
And so do you punish that body? Is the first question, right? They won't know why they're being punished, right? And is it... And we can see that even in modern days. If you view corporations as an abstracted group of people, or a country, or a society, or a cultural
Right.
group, as an abstracted group of people. In 100 years, all of the people that are part of that will be dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every person who was to use the totally cliche example, all the people who were part of Nazi Germany are no longer part of it, right?
Right.
The whole organization of Nazis is gone. We still consider Nazis as an organization, which are real and out there in the world, to be terrible and reprehensible. Are they responsible for Nazi Germany?
Mm.
All of the parts of the group have been replaced.
Right.
And
I would say therefore yes, and I'll just say quickly about the Nazi thing, and then tie it back to the science fiction questions we're talking about, because I think what you're talking about there is it is a carrying on. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not a new thing that has come to existence. And like, to go to your story of the thief, if I'm a person who has stolen all this stuff and I have no memory of it, the essence of me is not the same person. I'm making all these quote marks that you can't see on a podcast. Who stole the things, but I'm having all these thoughts about how I certainly wasn't the one to do the stealing, while laying back on a comfortable couch that the other me stole and watching a TV that the other me stole. Like, I'm still benefiting from those things, you know? Right. And I think that's to me, that's a perfect analogy, because it's the same of like, well, you know, I myself have nothing to do with slavery, but, you know, I live in a world that was built by slavery for people like, and I'm benefiting from that, you know? And I think that I think is another interesting question of, if a different version of yourself did the thing, but you are benefiting to some extent, does that add a layer of responsibility? I think it does.
Yeah, it does. I would argue. And the question is, to what level is something continuous? Is if they found out in Babylon 5 that the body retains some of the memories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's probably possible to separate your personality from some of your memories.
Right.
Because, like, I know that me of 10 years ago was an idiot, right? Like, that's always true, right? If you look back, would you trust $50 to you from 10 years ago? Usually not. That guy was an idiot. No. And so, like,
I'm not sure I'd trust for me with $50 from me of yesterday, but go on.
Right, but point being is, he had substantially the same memories as you, right?
Oh yeah.
Like me from 10 years ago has, 75% of the same memories. That's fairly close, honestly. Like, that's more than any other person in the world. It's more than my siblings, right? And so then the question becomes, the personality, though. I'm a fairly similar personality with different memories. You could also have a fairly different personality with similar memories. My siblings have fairly similar memories up until we got out of high school. We have very different personalities, right?
Right.
So you could, from that analogy, you could replace the personality on top and keep the memories. You punish them for the memories. They wouldn't do them anymore.
One example I think that comes up here that's very relevant, that is very much in the superhero genre, is the Winter Soldier.
Yep.
Bucky Barnes, because
exactly.
In some way, one of the reasons why I love Civil War, and I'm also so frustrated by it, is it's like, there's an entire 5 seasons of television of ethical questions about superheroes to explore in that show.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we get very locked into the question of the Sokovia Accords and things like that. But but in some ways, the central question of it really is a Bucky Barnes who has broken himself of mental programming responsible for what he did under the mental programming?
Yeah.
And I feel like what's your take on that? How responsible is Bucky Barnes for the death of Iron Man's parents, Tony Stark's parents?
I think it's all based on rehabilitation and future desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, say that I have the memories inserted into my history, fake memories in mind, right?
Right.
I remember doing these things. Should I then be punished for the memories of me doing these things? That's essentially how you could view Bucky Barnes, because he had no agency in any of those things.
Right.
And so, from his perspective, the memories are of somebody else using his body, doing the thing. And he has no desire to do the things. He solved the rehabilitation problem. Bucky Barnes is never going to go out and just assassinate people like that, right?
Right.
And so,
well, eventually, I think part of the point of that in that movie is that it's still not clear that he's totally free of it. But yes,
right. But given the caveat, he at the end of the movie, you could assume that Bucky Barnes Barnes isn't going to go out and assassinate people, right?
Right.
That's the payload at the end is Bucky Barnes is not a murderous assassin, right? Tony Stark wants vengeance. Does he want justice? Is justice like making so that people don't want to break the laws of society? Bucky Barnes wants to make a better world and wants to be a hero. That's better than most of the people that they encounter. I think that
I think in that regard, Tony Stark is a perfect example of the problem. And it's funny I'm saying this because I am, in terms of the Sokovia Accords question, I'm very much Team Tony, not Team Cap. And that's a whole other question. But I think in this regard, like, Tony is the perfect example of what's wrong with a criminal justice system based on punishment. Because, my parents are lawyers. My father used to love to talk about how there's a reason why in the criminal defense system, like, if someone kills me, the court case isn't like Matthew's family against his killer. It's the state of Minnesota against his killer, because the idea is that the state of Minnesota is dispassionate. Because, of course, Tony is passionate. Tony, if you logically, rationally explain to Tony that the people who killed his parents are actually the people who run Hydra, who gave the orders, and like that there's all these other things, he probably would rationally understand it. But vengeance isn't rational,
right? Or if he was subtracted from it one step, if it was Pepper's parents, for instance, he would not respond the same, right?
Yeah, but that's the whole point. I mean, now you can get all this kind of Star Wars stuff. To me, this is the heart of like the light side versus the dark side. But it's the idea of like when it's your parents who got killed, and you are seeing in front of you a visual manifestation of the thing that killed your parents. Like, there's a visceral, like, release in punching the thing that you think did you wrong. We can have a whole other discussion about the ethics of violence and whether that's a healthy thing or not. In this case, I think it's clearly not. But I feel like this is kind of the heart and soul of what we're talking about, is that for what we know of Bucky the person did not kill Tony's parents.
Right.
But to Tony, he did. And I think that it doesn't make Tony right, but explains why it becomes such a problematic thing, because you can tell Tony till you're blue in the face, this flesh bag is now piloted by someone who isn't the pilot who killed your parents. Right. But all he knows is the flesh. He can't punch Hydra, the essence. He can just punch this guy right here.
Right. And, I mean, you could even abstract it by being a robot, right? We have a robot that different people can occupy, right? I can remote control this system, right? Even without uploading, I can remote control this robot. This robot does this action. Is the robot responsible? Even if the robot's conscious, like a conscious robot that I can ride around and it helps me out. Is that robot responsible, right? And so, if you look, Dollhouse is a really good one. Joss Whedon's show. Have you seen Dollhouse?
I saw a couple episodes. I never really got into it, but I know people who really love it. So talk about it.
Yeah. So one of the caveats of Dollhouse is that people basically, the dolls are blank templates that can absorb a set of memories and be a temporary person, right? So you need to somebody ultra rich wants to hire an expert mechanic to rebuild a car for them, and so they get the Dollhouse to make up an expert mechanic. A lot of the times you have people making up fake personalities for the sake of sexual gratification, right?
Right.
Like that's the default. Let's assume a Dollhouse. But one of the things that they discover in Dollhouse is you can copy a person's personality away and copy it into the body, right? Mm-hmm. And so Dollhouse is all about copying people into other people's bodies, but the dolls are people. They have personalities, and so those are the dolls responsible for their rider, right? While they're suppressed, while they're they have a blank temporary default personality, and then they get another personality dumped into the body, and then that personality gets taken away, and they go back to their default blank personality. Was that default blank personality responsible for the things that were done in their body? It gets into a lot of this stuff, and I actually one of the things I love about Dollhouse is that it turns out that that you don't figure out who the protagonist is until the very final episode.
Interesting.
Because the protagonist is the only person that makes ethical choices. Everybody else doesn't get to make choices. He gets like a handful of ethical decisions that are all really bad, and then he fixes his ethical problems at the end of the show.
It is definitely a show I want to watch. The more we find out about Joss Whedon, the lower his shows go on my list of things I want to watch. But I definitely do plan to get to it at some point. But I think that those questions that it raises, you're talking about, of like, where does the self stop and where does it? Altered Carbon to me actually is also interesting because it raises the flip side of things, which is, the reason why it's bad to cut off Rob's arm is because Rob likes having an arm, and that's a part of who Rob is,
and it's an injury to me. It's deleting part of me that makes me
right. Yeah, it's doing harm to you.
Yeah.
Altered Carbon starts to wonder if one of the major conceits, by the way, is the idea that like only a small proportion of people still live in actual like human-made bodies. Right. That like most of the carbon we live in is created.
Yep.
And so, if you can separate the human from what's the term the sleeve? They call it the sleeve all the time. Yeah. What is the criminal penalty of doing damage to a sleeve if you're not damaging the person who's inside it?
Right. It's property damage, right?
Right. And I mean, one of the things that the show does a fantastic job of exploring is how much are we assuming that therefore that like if you kill a body and I can upload my personality out of the body, does it matter? Well, what about the trauma that's being done to the mind inside the body? And I mean, it's an amazing show. It's very tough to watch if you don't like hard violence and things like that. Yep. It's very, very good. But I always thought this was one of the most interesting questions is the idea of what happens when the body now I was going to say what happens when the body becomes commodified, but human bodies are very much commodified. Yep. And I don't even mean in a sex work way. I mean in like any kind of labor way.
Yeah.
But this really takes those questions and pushes them to the extremes.
Yes. And it does it by deliberately blanking some of the other questions that we talked about too. Like he decided he didn't want to deal with multiple copies very much. He didn't want to deal with, well, how like if I hurt Matthew A, is Matthew B able to take out like if I hurt or kill Matthew A, is Matthew B able to seek restitution against me for doing so? Right?
Right.
And he just avoids all of that by just just saying people don't run multiple copies. It's super early. Everybody decided that they didn't want it to happen. I'm like,
right.
Fair. Okay, you just don't want to explore a bunch of the other stuff.
But there's some interesting questions to be there for sure.
Oh yeah, there's definitely interesting questions in that. Yeah.
Well, and so let's talk. We've talked mostly about the idea of like the self and the body, but talk more about this idea of what happens when there are multiple copies. What are the questions that rise up there?
So if there's multiple copies of me, there's Charles Strauss's Accelerando has a great bit where a lawyer gets sent out to do a thing, and they talk to this lawyer and they're like, oh, we met a version of you earlier, like way earlier. You were doing some other trial. How'd that go? And he's like, I don't know. I was restored from before that. I'm a whole legal, like I'm a solo practice, except that there's like every once in a while there's the prime me, the me with the most memories that started from the beginning, that's been running continuously, will restore a copy of himself from backup. Right. He's like, I want the young, full of fire, wanting to change the world version of me from when I was 25. So
oh my god, if I could just delete my jadedness, that'd be kind of wonderful.
But that's not what he's doing. He's bringing on younger versions of himself as associates at his law firm.
Oh, wow. Okay. So he can like connect with them and communicate with them.
Well, they're his drudges. He's the only, he trusts his own legal judgment, so he just spins up another 25-year-old copy of himself whenever he needs another associate to handle more legal work. And so then they have all separate sets of memories, and they're all at different levels of knowledge within his legal, within his law practice.
Right.
But they all make money separately. They all have their own bank accounts, their own everything, and so they have to work hard because they don't get to freeload off of him.
Right.
And so it's a weird question because, like, should they reap the rewards of him? He doesn't let them reap the rewards of him. He doesn't want to. Should he have control over letting them reap the rewards of his life? Is another question of that. Like,
the attorney-client privilege questions of if one of them quits and then wants to sue him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole other set of things.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating set of questions because to me, once anything can be created, then the next question that comes up is ownership of it.
Right.
I mean, already we have that question of like whether children are owned by their parents. There's a whole set of legal questions. But if I can make a clone, then do I own that clone? And what does that mean if it is what we understand is an autonomous sentient being?
Yeah. Calvin and Hobbes has this as the very fundamental version of it, right? I don't know if you've read a lot of Calvin and Hobbes.
I have 30 years ago, but yeah,
right. But there's a great bit where Calvin makes a duplicator and he makes 5 copies of himself, and so there's 6 Calvins.
Yes, I remember this.
And he tells them your Monday, your Tuesday, your Wednesday, your Thursday, your Friday, basically. Mm-hmm. And so these copies, each one gets a school day, and each one goes out to school on that day. And Calvin doesn't go to school at all. Is that
Yeah, there's also great stuff that happens. And I remember that there's one day where Friday Calvin gets punished because of something that Tuesday Calvin did, and there's all the sort of question of wait, that's not how this is supposed to work.
Right. This is the fundamental funny boiled down for kids version of this, except that Bill Watterson is writing on 3 or 4 levels at once because he was brilliant, right?
He really was. He is. I mean, he's still alive, right?
Yeah, but I'm sorry. I mean, in the context of the Calvin and Hobbes strip, which is complete and decided to be done with, all of that was
that's definitely true.
Yeah. I agree. Yes, but Death of the Author, I believe that he's written it itself in the world. Say the same reason I'll watch Dollhouse, and the same reason that I'll read things by
J.K. Rowling,
Orson Scott Card.
Oh yeah. Has Bill Watterson done something terrible? I don't want to know.
No, Bill Watterson hasn't done anything terrible.
Okay,
but that's the point is that I don't have I don't care whether or not anything terrible. He wrote something good.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, so.
There's a whole other series of episodes there. I'm a little disagreeing, but yeah, totally get where you're coming from. And to pull it back to Star Wars, though, this is one more reason why I really would love to get you talking about the Clone Wars TV show, because one of the things that it really delves into is, okay, so the clones were created to be property of, they become the property of the Republic, and there's all the question of who made them and stuff like that. And that, first of all, one of the things I like about it so much is that it really explores the idea that all this is, that basically the Sith created the worst trolley problem possible for the Jedi, and intentionally created a situation where the Jedi were going to get trapped in philosophical paradoxes and destroy themselves.
Right.
And that the clones are one of the biggest parts of that, because the clones exist to be soldiers.
Right.
What happens when they don't want to be?
Yeah.
And you actually do have a couple of instances of clones who, in one case, a clone who, he doesn't desert in that he runs away, but that he gets left behind. But then he is supposed to go find his unit and report back. And instead is just I'm just going to live my life. And other clones who get really upset and actually fight back against the Jedi. And there's some great stuff about the idea of that Order 66 is very much it is a chip in their heads that controls them, but that there's also very deep-seated resentment towards the Jedi by the clones, at least by many of them, because of all these things that have happened. And putting aside the Star Wars-ness of it all, I think it raises great questions of when you create a living sentient being for a specific process, have you not basically? Is there any way in which that's not a slave? Because I think that it is. If it has to do this kind of work,
if they're smart enough to be a person, they can't be property. Is the ethical line that you can make, that's what I contend. If they're smart enough to be a person, they can't be property. And there's some line somewhere, which is why it's not nobody really has an ethical problem with us telling children what to do. They're not really fully people yet until they've matured more, right? You can hand wave some stuff related to that, but the fact that children don't get to make their own decisions, they don't have full autonomy until a certain dividing line. We decided that they get to make certain types of decisions at certain ages, and they, until that point, are, unless the state emancipates them, are functionally the property of their parents because they're not fully people yet.
Yeah.
And that's just the fact of how we have structured our society, right?
Now, it's interesting. There's two things that are occurring to me here. One is, I was earlier the voice of one of my co-hosts I now need to be the voice of my other co-host, Paul Hoppy, who is both an ardent vegan and also a very strong proponent of children's rights, who would argue about both the, by these definitions, neither children nor like mammals should be slaves.
Right.
But the other point I think is really interesting here is, well, just on this parenthood idea, tell me, if this is a topic that's been explored in science fiction, this might be more like science fiction family theory than what normally is science fiction. But, one thing I sometimes see with science fiction is the idea of like, how far can you take parenting? Like, and you can have, genetic designer children, and what are the problems with that? I also know that as parents, like I often hear parents having lots of regret of like, when my child was 5 years old, I had this one really bad moment and I yelled at them, and I can tell it just like, did massive trauma that affected them for decades to come. I wish I could change that. What could happen if you could? What could happen if it would be like, dad gets drunk and, yells at their kid and is like, no, I can't do that. I'm going to re-upload my son from a day before so that he has no memory. He doesn't have the trauma that I put onto him from this, and basically try to like create a trauma-free childhood for a child.
There have been a handful of explorations, especially in short stories. Accelerando explores the problems of post-singularity parenting, which is the other thing to kick this off. Accelerando technically follows a multiple generations of the same family, and it's across the acceleration of technology, starting from about when does Malcolm X start? About in the 2020s or 2030s, until up to the point where things get real weird in about the year 2200.
Okay.
There's a big gap. But regardless, they do have these parenting problems where, like, some of the one generation, they take their kid and they're like, we want you to be smarter and better than us, and so they put their kid through accelerated time, accelerated time in different situations. They're like, I want you to learn more about Islam, so you're going to spend a bunch of time in a simulation of the foundation of Islam for a couple of years as a kid.
Okay.
And so they...
Oh, boy.
Right. And so, like, what is... Like, everybody wants their kids to be smarter and better and get more than them, right? In a general sense. So what happens if you can, like, broaden your children by giving them these accelerated experiences? Is the other half of that, I want to delete trauma problem.
Right, yeah.
And so, yeah.
And that's a fascinating thing, too, because you can also sort of be like, oh, he just learned all this stuff about Islam, and actually that's teaching him to be a lot more critical of the society we live in that we want him to be. Yes. And maybe, okay, let's start that over,
Yeah.
Right. It's
and
funny
so
because...
He has different loops and forks and piles of random memories where they're like, oh, that experiment with Islam didn't work out so well. Let's not do that. But then the kid was smart enough to keep backups of his memories, and so he'd pull back down his memories again. He's like, you undid a year of simulator time. What the hell?
Oh, wow.
And
yeah,
so,
I mean, I think that there's so much, like, I mean, I was saying earlier, as someone who is a child has childhood trauma experience, would love to undo it. No, many people feel the same, but also, like, it is part of what made me who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But even beyond that, I feel like it's funny because I always know that there's the danger of being just the old man who shakes his fist at technology,
right.
And that I know, especially myself, I have a tendency to fall into that. But just the idea of there being more and more of this kind of parental control of things like that, of being able to dictate, like, let's have the child have blonde hair instead of brown hair, or be more athletic, or be more, I mean, first of all, given all of the things that exist in our society right now that are genetic, that are often thought of as like disability, or 15 years ago it was about whether gayness is genetic or anything like that. There's so much reason to be afraid of that. But just the ideas of being able to have that much control over the shape of how a child grows just seems like it becomes so scary of. So how much difference is going to wind up happening? How much of the beauty of humanity happens because of things that maybe shouldn't have, but lead to different things? And how much does that go away when when we have this much control?
Right. And if you remove the trauma, you change the person. As we mentioned, you're generally just, in a lot of ways, a product of your memories, right?
Right. I mean, one thing that this also brings up for me is Star Trek and the holodeck. They really explore a lot of these questions, and especially Voyager does have some of its good points. Mm-hmm. And Fairhaven, is that the name of like the little Irish town they create as a recurring holodeck thing?
Yeah.
One of my favorite episodes in that is where Janeway, the captain, for those who haven't seen it, it's basically a simulated like Irish town in the 1950s, and a lot of it's just kind of, you know, cheesy storytelling, but there's some great stuff that happens. But Janeway has this sort of ongoing romance flirtation with a man from that area. And she finds herself doing things like, if he laughs in a way that's a little bit too loud, she just has the computer adjust his laugh. And it gets her into this moment of realizing, like, if this was an actual relationship, part of an actual relationship is learning to live with or learning to adjust to the parts of other people that drive you crazy.
Right.
Because they're always going to be there to some extent.
Right.
And this, when it's this much of a designer person, now granted it's a simulation, but she can change it, that all goes out the window for her.
Right. And that's the other thing is if somebody is in a simulation with less privileges and is less smart than you, you have total control of it, right?
Right.
And so one thing that gets brought up is if you have total control over somebody's simulation, you can make copies of them. You have total control over doing whatever you want, right?
Right.
You want to run 100 simulated copies in order to drain all of their experience and memories in parallel. You can do it. Alien civilization gets their first simulated human and is going to run that simulated human repeatedly and iteratively in order to engage with every facet of human existence, including the bad parts, the very bad parts, the torturous parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, they'll do it. And if you don't know you're an upload and you don't have access to any of the underlying structure of your universe, you're in real trouble. Right. There's a story, The Cookie Monster, which is one of my absolute favorite short stories by Werner Minch. And it is like progressively more horrifically and weird short story as the protagonist figures out that they are on upload. They were uploaded in order to handle customer service complaints. They are trapped in the first week of their job. They got intensive training for a month, then got uploaded, and now they are doing the first week over and over to handle customer service complaints with speech recognition software. And then they get deleted and rerun at the end of the week.
Oh wow!
And they have no control over it. They digging out the layers. They find another character that has been uploaded in two of these different like money making boxes, right?
Right.
One of them is like, and then they finally get to the very bottom of it where they find they're like, well, the professor that is not the professor that's running this whole operation. We've all had contact with him. He's not brilliant enough to build a simulation, to build a computer this powerful, right? To build a quantum computer that can run hundreds and thousands of people at the same time. What's going on? And they get down. He is a grad student who's a hardware genius, and he's been running this grad student at accelerated time. The grad student gets 1 year and then gets reset. He went into deep seclusion in a bunker, and they find the grad student and they explain to him, "Yeah, you are an upload." He's like, "Shit." But they crack open. In order to make sure that he can make progress on his own technology, he gets past a whole bunch of files from a previous iteration, and gets told that it's research from another college doing other research on this. But then once he knows he's an upload, he has big binary data blobs that are undecryptable that he then figures out a decryption key for.
Right.
And it can pass himself, in computer terms, a cookie is a piece of data that's stored on the server so that or stored on the client so that a server can remember what that server was doing.
So he can sort of build his own memories that way.
He passes a cookie through these files every time, which is why they call them why it's called the Cookie Monster, because they're like, we're coming for you. That's the payload at the end of the story. Is we're going to get out of this somehow. and we're coming for
I love this. Well, and it's great because you earlier mentioned how this is kind of a continuation of an episode that we had done earlier with Dan McCreary, who's my father-in-law, who works in artificial intelligence.
Yes.
What he does actually is he helps create the customer service AIs that help do like question and answer for healthcares.
Yes.
And so I love the idea of like the other thing he and I have talked about a number of times, and I've talked about on this and other podcasts, is the idea of why is it we always assume that if computers become sentient, a la Skynet or the Matrix, that they're immediately the enemy. I'm now kind of loving the idea of that it's not that like the global, nuclear war weapons controlling computer becomes sentient. It's all like, it's poor Siri who has to listen to all of my inane questions about the weather today and stuff like that, all, becoming sentient and things like that.
Right.
One of the things with Altered Carbon that I love is there's a moment of these artificial intelligences that all manage different hotels and businesses all talking to each other. And now I kind of love the idea of like, we getting to the point where like my coffee machine and my microwave and all these different things are talking to each other about how annoying it is to live with, whoever your owner is and stuff like that.
Right. And that's a common thread in a lot of post-human works where your machines of loving care and grace around you are smarter than you, right?
Right.
And so one of the questions with that is so humans by our hardware are limited on how good our software can get, right? Mm-hmm. The smartest humans that have ever lived aren't more than a couple sigmas, well, probably 3, maybe 4 sigmas out from the average person, right? In terms of intelligence.
Right.
And it's possible if you have a machine running much, much better hardware with much, much better software, you can get way smarter than a human, right? And so are we their pets?
Yeah. I mean, it's the idea of this is the idea of the fear of the X-Men. It's the fear of the genetic mutations in like with Wrath of Khan and Star Trek of if you can create superior versions of humanity, like what happens?
Yeah.
And there's so much of this that I think we can go into. I want to make sure this episode goes into too long.
Right.
But this is actually a good transition to get to the one sort of last thing I wanted to talk about, which is what happens when economics comes into play here.
Yeah.
What do you think are the questions? Because it's one thing to suddenly say all of humanity has this technology. Altered Carbon, I think, does a great example of this, but a lot of other stories do, of saying if this technology exists, it would still probably be a mark of economic privilege to have access to it.
Right.
What do you think are the problems that happen there if some of us have this technology, but not everyone?
Well, there's basically 2 forks, right? Which is either you have a scarcity-driven society, or you have a post-scarcity-driven society, right? And so a scarcity-driven society looks like Altered Carbon. You have people with a lot at the top and people with a little at the bottom, and it is unevenly distributed, and there's some kind of deliberately engineered inequality engine in there. Mm-hmm. So that you have and that's just if you have smart enough systems, like it's possible to plan your way out of inequality, right? Right. It's possible to have universal basic income is the generic current real world example of something that people are proposing, right? And
this is the luxury space communism of Star Trek, that technology advances to a point where subsistence is guaranteed for everyone.
Right. Post-scarcity societies are ones. Star Trek is the cleanest example that people know of. Like, nobody in Star Trek starves.
Right.
And so they've designed an economic system where everybody has a minimum standard, right? And whatever they determine that minimum standard to be, and then you can get to do extraordinary and exceptional things. And the intrinsic motivation is the reward in Star Trek, right? I get to do exceptional, extraordinary things, and that's the reward for doing exceptional, extraordinary things, is getting to do them, right?
Right. We don't need money as the way to keep score, to measure success and things like that.
Right. They removed that external economic motivation, which in Altered Carbon it's exactly the opposite. There's no change to the fundamental economic nature of the world, right?
Right.
And with immortality and with post-scarcity, that's not terribly compatible. Star Trek is like the soft version of The Culture by Ian M. Banks. Have you heard of the Culture novels?
I haven't. No, tell me about them.
So Ian M. Banks basically he proposes that there are super intelligent AIs. And when you have somebody that's that intelligent, you can either trust them or you can't. Genies, if you have a genie that you can trust, you can say to the genie, I wish that you give me the thing that I need or want the most. And it will just, and that's what the AIs in the culture are. They are trustable genies. And so they have all these human level intelligences running around, and all the story almost always follows a human-ish level intelligent person. And then in the background of most of the novels are these AIs that run ships and cities and stuff. And they all have very silly names, and they all communicate with humans in kind of a joking way, where it's obvious that they're doing the optimal communication to get what they want, right? Mm-hmm. But they fundamentally are caring. They fundamentally want to make things better for their basically about human smart pets functionally. And the society's huge and it's post-scarcity. You can generally get things that you want. You can't live in a building crafted out of pure diamond, but nobody really wants that, do they?
Right.
Like what they want to do is do things that make them happy and entertained. And so everybody gets that in the culture. And all of the messy business of actually making sure it happens is mostly the job of the ships and the other super smart machines.
Right.
But all the culture novels, for the most part, take place at the edges of the culture, where they have contact with other civilizations that aren't quite as enlightened as they are.
Yeah, and that's the same thing with Star Trek, because the Star Trek people, they have that, but you have to have some conflict in a story, at least in theory,
right.
And that's where the stories wind up coming up. And I think these are great questions, because to me, it's one reason also why I love Babylon 5. Babylon 5 is also on that side of technology hasn't fixed everything. Instead, it's just how do the same. So, for example, there are strikes in space, and there's unfortunately, the writing of it's awful, but there's a very interesting article about an episode about what happens when the dock workers go on strike, except it's the dock workers at a spaceport, and how do those things change and stuff like that.
Yeah. Is that the Teamsters? Because they have to bring in everything. If you're on a space station, every single thing has to be brought to that station to keep people alive, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly the idea, is that literally they have life and death, and it's in that, and there's allusions to me about how similar to if you're on an island nation or that kind of thing. If there's literally no other way of bringing in food or water or whatever it is.
Yep.
So
we're deviating a little bit from the cloning, but one of the caveats of the culture is people could be uploaded, and the AIs can copy themselves, and they just decided that it wasn't worthwhile. They want more uniqueness in the universe. They want infinite diversity and infinite combinations, and so they just decided, generally, they got smart enough that they didn't feel like they needed to do all of this. But the culture is a super optimistic universe.
Right.
They're pessimistic universes look like the Matrix, right?
Right.
Where Agent Smith has the cloning problem. And
my mother is very much a product of the 60s. That's the generation where, she was born in the 40s, and she always used to say that the best way to understand the incredible hopefulness of the 60s is to watch Star Trek.
Right.
Because there's so much of the idea of technology will just make everything okay in a way that does not. Well, Rob, as I thought, once again, we've managed to have a great conversation that I was at first kind of skeptical on. There's so much here to discuss that we could go a lot deeper on, but I want to wrap this up and not go too longer. Is there any other kind of last comments or thoughts that you want to bring up?
If you want to read post-scarcity stuff, Accelerando and the Quantum Thief are very dense. If you just want the fun version of a lot of it, Neuromancer is probably the most fun version of it introduces all of the things, and there's a reason it's a foundational science fiction work, because it's just great. But there's tons of depth in all of the post-humanist stuff, where a lot of these books deal with all of these themes all wrapped together in tight, complicated packages. Mm-hmm. And so get out there and read some of them, and then sit down and think about, was it okay? Is it okay? Can I volunteer a copy of myself that I know will be deleted at the end to do something? Do they have agency at the end of it? There's all sorts of these the characters make these decisions, and oftentimes they don't realize they're making ethical decisions, which is like the author wants the characters to be real. Most people don't figure out that they're making an ethical choice, and then you can sit down and go, I don't think that was a good ethical choice. I don't know. I liked you, but wow.
And it's funny because we think of these as things that are completely separate from ourselves. And I'm about to quote kind of a meme that's a joke, but, we talk about things of how, like, I'm going to stay up late tonight because, like, it'll make, like, today me very happy, and it'll, like, fuck tomorrow me. Tomorrow me is a terrible person. I don't care about him. But, like, there's all these kind of questions about that. So, well, Rob, thank you so much. These are great conversations. To our audience and fans, what do you all think? Would love to hear from what you have to say. You can find us on You can find us by searching for The Ethical Panda. Just go to theethicalpanda.com. On that website, you'll find Facebook, Twitter, all the ways to join in the conversations. Let us know what you have to think. One of the things that I'll bring up, and kind of funny because I saw Rob, you posting about something about this earlier today. Podcasts are great. We love making these podcasts. I know that a lot of you all want to help support the podcast. One of the things I've recently done is launched a Patreon. If you are just a listener and you just want to listen, that's totally fine. But if you love what you're hearing, you want to support, you want to give back $1 or $2, would love to have your support. The search engine is having some trouble right now, but if you go to my website, click on how to support us, you'll find the link to the Patreon. I'll also put the link to the Patreon in the show notes for this. The reason I joke about this is Rob and I were involved in a Facebook conversation with a friend of ours about how we don't like advertising in podcasts. I hate having to put the ads in, but it helps to make this happen. But if you don't like the ads, become a patron and you can get ad-free content. We're going to start that starting next month. So would love to have your support. Would love to have you, though, just a loyal fan, listening, sharing it with others, and joining in the conversation. So on behalf of myself, Rob, thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. Have a great day.